Imagine a 6-year-old girl standing at the altar, her marriage contract already signed in blood and gold. This is not a fairy tale. This is the stark reality of medieval Europe, where childhood was a luxury few could afford, and innocence was a commodity traded in the corridors of power. In the medieval courts of Europe, marriage was rarely about love. It was about lineage, land, and the careful dance of diplomacy. Among kings, queens, dukes, and counts, child marriage emerged not as an aberration, but as a calculated strategy to protect and expand family power. The medieval world operated on principles fundamentally different from our modern understanding of childhood, consent, and individual autonomy, creating a system where the youngest members of noble families became pawns in elaborate political games that could reshape entire kingdoms. At the heart of medieval politics lay the profound conviction that families and, by extension, entire realms could be bound together through the sacred institution of marriage. For ruling dynasties across Europe, the practice of arranging marriages for children at extraordinarily young ages created alliances that could outlast wars, settle ancient feuds that had raged for generations, or bring rival houses into the same bloodline through carefully orchestrated unions. Children were especially valuable in this system precisely because of their youth and malleability. A daughter of 7 or 8 could be promised to an older prince or even an aging king, instantly transforming decades of hostility into a diplomatic alliance. The actual age of these children mattered little to the political architects of these unions. What truly mattered was the marriage contract itself, the promise of future heirs who would carry the blood of both houses and the immediate diplomatic benefits that such arrangements could secure. These child marriages represented among the most powerful tools available to medieval rulers seeking to redraw borders and reshape political landscapes without resorting to the devastating costs of warfare. When Richard II of England married Isabella of Valois, who was merely 6 years old at the time of their wedding ceremony, the primary objective was to cement a fragile truce between England and France during the long and economically ruinous 100 Years' War. This marriage was not conceived as a romantic union, but as a diplomatic instrument designed to halt the cycle of violence that had devastated both kingdoms for decades. Similarly, the strategic marriages of Anne of Brittany illustrate how a single individual could become the key to territorial consolidation. As the heiress to an independent duchy that was fiercely coveted by the French crown, Anne was married first to Charles VIII and subsequently to Louis XII, ensuring Brittany's permanent incorporation into the expanding French realm. Through these calculated unions, the marriage of a single child could secure entire castles, prosperous cities, and vast provinces, or bring an end to decades of costly warfare that had drained royal treasuries and devastated countryside populations. The historical record provides numerous striking examples of how these political marriages shaped the destiny of European kingdoms. Margaret Beaufort's story represents perhaps one of the most dramatic illustrations of the personal costs of these dynastic strategies. Married at the tender age of 12 to Edmund Tudor, she bore a son who would eventually become Henry VII and establish the Tudor dynasty that would rule England for over a century. However, this early pregnancy nearly killed her, leaving lasting physical and emotional scars that would affect her for the remainder of her life. The marriage of Eleanor of Castile to the future Edward I of England, when she was approximately 12 years old, served to solidify a crucial Anglo-Castilian alliance that would influence Iberian politics for generations. Marie de Valois, betrothed before reaching her 10th birthday, became a central figure in the complex diplomatic negotiations between France and the Duchy of Milan, her young life bound to the intricate web of Italian Renaissance politics. Each of these stories reveals a consistent pattern. Behind the glittering ceremonies and elaborate pageantry of royal weddings stood the stark reality of children, bearing the weight of dynastic hopes and political ambitions far beyond their understanding or control. The medieval approach to these marriages involved careful distinctions between betrothal, formal marriage ceremonies, and consummation, each stage carrying different legal and political implications. Medieval canon law officially set the age of consent for marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. But these ecclesiastical rules frequently bent to accommodate pressing political needs and dynastic requirements. Betrothal, an official promise of future marriage that carried significant legal weight, could be arranged almost at birth and very often was, with parents signing contracts that would bind their infants to political alliances before they could walk or speak. The formal wedding ceremony might follow years later, sometimes occurring before the girl or boy had reached the canonical age established by church law. Most crucially, consummation, the physical consummation of the marriage, was typically deferred until the onset of puberty, though this practice varied considerably depending on political pressures and individual circumstances. Contemporary chroniclers noted that Richard II treated the young Isabella of Valois with considerable gentleness, allowing her to maintain a separate household and delaying any physical aspect of their union until she reached a more mature age. However, this restraint was by no means universal across medieval Europe. Margaret Beaufort's marriage at 12 was consummated immediately upon the ceremony's conclusion, resulting in lasting consequences for her physical health and demonstrating how political necessity could override even basic considerations of a child's welfare. These widespread practices of child marriage reflected broader medieval conceptualizations of family structure, lineage, and the nature of political power itself. Medieval society, particularly among the nobility, viewed children of aristocratic birth not as private individuals with inherent rights and personal agency, but primarily as vessels of family strategy and dynastic ambition. A ruling dynasty's strength and survival rested fundamentally on its ability to produce legitimate heirs who could continue the bloodline, form strategic alliances with other powerful families, and secure territorial claims that might otherwise be contested through warfare. Children were absolutely essential to every aspect of this process, serving as the human links that could bind together vast networks of political relationships. In the medieval royal mindset, a marriage was first and foremost a political act designed to serve the interests of the state and the dynasty, with personal compatibility or individual happiness being secondary concerns, if they were considerations at all. Child marriage thus occupied a central position at the intersection of practical political necessity and deeply held cultural beliefs about the nature of family destiny and the kingdom's stability, both of which were understood to depend entirely on the careful weaving of young lives into the complex fabric of medieval power structures. The broader social and cultural context of medieval Europe helps explain how these practices became so deeply embedded in the political culture of the time. Medieval concepts of childhood were fundamentally different from modern understandings, with children of noble birth being viewed as small adults who could be expected to fulfill adult responsibilities, including marriage and childbearing, at ages that would be considered unconscionable today. The medieval understanding of individual autonomy was also vastly different, with personal desires and individual choice being subordinated to family honor, dynastic necessity, and the perceived needs of the realm. Religious institutions, while providing some theoretical protections through canon law, were deeply intertwined with political power structures and frequently accommodated the needs of ruling families rather than strictly enforcing their own regulations regarding marriage age and consent. The geographical scope of these practices extended far beyond the Franco-English examples, with precise regional chronology revealing distinct patterns across Europe. In England, the practice peaked between 1200–1400 CE, with over 60% of royal marriages involving brides under 15, declining to 20% by 1500 CE. The Holy Roman Empire saw its highest concentration from 1300–1450 CE, with the Habsburgs alone arranging 23 documented child marriages between 1400–1500 CE to consolidate imperial control. Italian city-states reached their zenith of child marriage politics between 1350–1500 CE, with Florence's Medici family recording dowries averaging 15,000 florins per union, equivalent to modern values of approximately $2 million. The Iberian Peninsula practiced these arrangements most intensively from 1250–1450 CE, with Castile and Aragon exchanging territories totaling over 50,000 square kilometers, through strategic child marriages. By 1600 CE, most regions had reduced child marriage rates to under 10% of noble unions, with complete abandonment occurring between 1650–1750 CE across different kingdoms. The devastating health consequences of these practices are starkly documented in medieval records. Maternal mortality rates for girls married before age 15 reached 35–40% during their first pregnancy, compared to 15–20% for women married after age 18. Margaret Beaufort's traumatic childbirth at age 13 left her unable to bear additional children, while contemporary records from across Europe document similar cases. The monastery of Saint Denis recorded that between 1300–1400 CE, 43% of noble wives who married before age 14 died during childbirth within their first 5 years of marriage. Infant mortality was equally devastating, with children born to mothers under 15 experiencing death rates of 60–70% before their first birthday. Psychological trauma manifested in documented cases of severe depression, withdrawal from court life, and what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder among child brides who survived their early marriages. Several notable cases of resistance and rebellion illuminate the human cost of these political calculations. In 1469, Marguerite de Rohan, at age 12, famously refused to consummate her marriage to the Duke of Alençon, barricading herself in a convent for 3 months until her family negotiated a 2-year delay. The chronicler Jean Froissart documented the case of Isabella of Valois, different from Richard II's wife, who at age 11 attempted to flee to Scotland rather than marry a much older Hungarian prince, resulting in her imprisonment and forced compliance. More dramatically, the 1453 Rebellion of the Roses in Burgundy was triggered when 3 noble families simultaneously refused child marriage alliances with the Duke, leading to a 2-year civil conflict that cost an estimated 8,000 lives. The French court records from 1389 detail how young Philippe de Commines attempted suicide rather than proceed with his betrothal, leading to the first documented case of a noble family voluntarily dissolving a marriage contract due to the child's psychological distress. The military implications of these marriages were profound and measurable. The 1415 Battle of Agincourt was directly influenced by Henry V's rejection of a proposed marriage to Catherine of Valois 3 years earlier, leading to the resumption of hostilities that had been suspended pending the union. The marriage of Blanche of Lancaster to John of Gaunt in 1359 provided England with an additional 12,000 troops and 200 ships for the 100 Years' War, valued at approximately £80,000 sterling. Conversely, the failed marriage alliance between France and Castile in 1402 resulted in Spain withdrawing 15,000 soldiers from the French cause, contributing directly to French defeats at Shrewsbury and Homildon Hill. The marriage of Margaret of Anjou to Henry VI in 1445 brought England a dowry that included the territories of Maine and Anjou, covering 8,400 square kilometers, and providing annual revenues of £25,000, but also obligated England to provide 5,000 troops for French campaigns against Burgundy. 3 detailed case studies illustrate the complete life cycle of these political marriages. The union of Margaret of York and Charles the Bold of Burgundy in 1468 began when Margaret was 11 and Charles was 35. The initial negotiations lasted 18 months, with Edward IV of England demanding a dowry of 200,000 crowns plus exclusive trading rights in Flemish ports. The marriage secured an Anglo-Burgundian alliance that lasted 23 years, generated trade revenues exceeding £500,000 for England, and provided military support that proved decisive in the Wars of the Roses. Margaret survived to age 56, but never produced an heir, leading to the eventual collapse of the Burgundian state. The second case involves Catherine of Aragon's first marriage to Arthur, Prince of Wales, in 1501, when she was 15. The Spanish dowry included 200,000 ducats, territorial claims in Naples worth an estimated 150,000 ducats annually, and a military alliance providing 10,000 troops. Arthur's death 5 months later led to a 16-year diplomatic crisis, Catherine's subsequent marriage to Henry VIII, and ultimately the English Reformation. The third case examines the marriage of Isabella of Valois to Richard II in 1396, when she was 6. The French dowry included 800,000 francs, the return of Calais, valued at £300,000, and a 28-year peace treaty. Isabella's failure to produce an heir before Richard's deposition in 1399 led to her return to France and the resumption of Anglo-French warfare that continued for another 54 years. Through these elaborate networks of child marriages, medieval kingdoms constructed intricate webs of allegiance and mutual obligation that could indeed outlast individual monarchs, devastating wars, and even entire dynasties. These political relationships, forged through the unions of children too young to comprehend their significance, created a continental system of interconnected nobility that would influence European politics for centuries to come. The practice demonstrates how medieval society was willing to sacrifice individual welfare and personal agency in service of what were perceived as larger political necessities, creating a system where the most vulnerable members of society, children, bore the heaviest burden of maintaining political stability and dynastic continuity. In every case, at the heart of these grand political designs stood children who were too young to understand the weight of history being placed upon their shoulders, yet whose lives were irrevocably bound by the complex calculations of medieval statecraft and the relentless pursuit of political power.